Let's go live now to Mark Kenny, ANU Professor of the Australia Studies Institute. Thanks as always, Mark. You see those stories out of the UK, out of Spain, and then our Health Minister today saying we're seeing a consolidated flattening of the curve here. It's a very different situation that we're facing.
Oh, it certainly is, Kieran. I think there's a general consensus in this country that right across the political spectrum, and I suspect across the community, that our government has responded well. That, when I say our government, I mean all of our governments really have been operating together in a manner that is a whole lot more constructive and a whole lot more encouraging, really, than we've been used to seeing from our federation, which mostly is noted for its kind of levels of dysfunction. But really, all levels of government have been working together. The federal government has leaned into this. I think the Prime Minister, who really came out of the bushfire crisis in a state of political crisis of his own, knew that he couldn't get this wrong, and I think that probably, in a strange, perverse way, served Australia quite well, because he's, with a couple of missteps along the way, but every single government around the world has made missteps. But I think Australia has done well, and that's reflecting in the very encouraging low numbers we see now.
And from the government, yes, federal and state, but also from the individuals themselves, Mark. I know police in Queensland, some other jurisdictions have said they've had to hand out a few fines, but really, by and large, this has been an Australian community that has stepped up to the plate, so to speak.
It has, and it's really quite interesting because we have this myth about ourselves as being larrikins, as being people who thumb a nose to authority a bit, that we laid back and we largely do as we please. But I think what this has shown is that Australians are quite obedient, or perhaps to put it in a more constructive way, it's shown that Australians are persuaded by a good argument when it is put forward to them, that we understand enlightened self-interest. And what we've had here is pretty unusual. I mean, that goes without saying for this crisis, but we've had a pretty unusual situation where both sides of politics have been talking, saying the same thing, singing from the same song sheet, and that in itself is quite persuasive. Interestingly, that was the case earlier on with climate change to some extent, and we saw some progress there too before the two sides split apart. So we're getting an object lesson, I think, in what happens when you get a degree of unity from the political class. We know that's the case in the relatively few referendums that have passed in the past in Australia's history. That is when both sides are arguing for something that's far more persuasive. But it's really been reflected in a high level of community take-up here in respect of all of these restrictions. And as you say, the cops have been out there, levelling fines at some people and dissolving some groups and so forth. But by and large, I think the Australian response has been very comprehensive.
The next question is, and I'm going to be speaking to Peter Doherty, Professor Doherty, the Nobel laureate, later in the program, and he obviously, like so many others, have a great interest in trying to find not just treatment for this thing, but a vaccine. I guess that's the next step that will provide the boost, the morale, the confidence in the medium to longer term, Mark.
It is the next step. It's almost like the next critical step, because we are actually in a bit of a cul-de-sac here. We've retreated to our homes. We've kind of atomised as a society as we've needed to cease any unnecessary physical sort of contact. And that has worked very well. But what's the next stage? I mean, the next stage is either a vaccine, which is always talked about, but which we're told may not happen at all, let alone may not happen in any sort of short time frame. I mean, 18 months is now sort of an optimistic sort of number we're hearing, if it's to happen at all. And of course, the other thing, and probably more likely thing, is some sort of treatment that is effective enough so that you can make this a less, or ideally a non-lethal disease to contract. But either of those things are really the only circuit breakers you can imagine from where we are at the moment. Otherwise, we are going to either have to have all of these social restrictions continue, or if we release them, if we lift them in some way, we'll have to keep our borders shut, because you can't have a situation where you're having a lot of social contact and then having people coming in from overseas who can bring the disease, introduce them into a community that's no longer observing spatial distancing, and then you have an outbreak all over again. So we're sort of trapped by our success at the moment. You'd rather be trapped by your success than in the US, where the president has been an abject failure. But the next step is crucial, as you're saying. We just don't really know what it's going to be at this stage.